Now you're on. Okay, guys. Welcome to tonight's meetup. I'm glad you all made it despite this freak thunderstorm thing we have going on out there. It's one of the fun ones where it's not like a full thunderstorm, but you have these pockets where it gets slick and scary and you can't see. And then 50 feet later, it's sunny. So, you know, those are the best. So we want to, as we get started, first thing first, we want to thank MX for having this beautiful building and pizza. Thank you, MX, and Garrett specifically for remembering. He's here on his anniversary because his wife is working. So they can celebrate tomorrow. What other? Okay. So my announcements were thank you, MX. If you're interested to speak, if you're interested in speaking at this meetup, you can just find me. We're looking for speakers starting in August through the end of the year. So always looking for speakers. Any kinds of material is great. Obviously, we like anything that has ML in the title. Is there anybody here who'd like to share that they're hiring for anything in the data ML space? Cool. We don't have any others. My last announcement is don't forget to join the Forge Slack. If you remember any jobs later, you can just put it in the jobs channel. There's also a machine learning channel. And my new favorite channel is the hardware channel because that's where I post about how hard it is to start a freaking Raspberry Pi and get a power supply for the Raspberry Pi and turn on the Raspberry Pi. That was I couldn't figure out how to turn it on. I did last night, guys. It works now. So, yeah, we're gonna have a Kubernetes cluster thing going on. So, yes, and hey, I'm gonna turn the time over to our speaker Ryan, who is our speaker. I just don't want this picture. Oh, I know. Cool. So with that, it's all you. You got your mic ready to go?
You guys hear me? Yep. Oh, that works perfect. Awesome. Okay. That works. Okay. Oh, that is loud. Is it? That's really loud. Looks like about that. That's a little better. Yeah. Okay. Cool. A lot of you know who I am. I'm Ryan Russon. This is not my first rodeo here in the whole. Yeah. Okay. I'll just talk at a normal level. Okay. So. Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about this topic in particular today. Security usually is not a fun topic for a lot of people, but it is something that I think, especially in the ML space, is lacking, I think, in understanding in terms of what it is, especially if you work for a company and you're in public facing in any way, shape, or form with anything you're doing, right? This is probably something that you're concerned about, and especially in a day and age when containers are pretty much the way we do a lot of business. But first, before we get going here, let's have a story, okay? So let's say you're working for whatever company, whoever it is, awesomecompany.co, and you're building a model, some generative AI model, doesn't matter, something cool, right? You're building a model for them, and you're finishing it up, and you are trying to get this thing deployed. So of course, what you're gonna do is you're gonna go through and you're going to put your model into a container, right? To a Docker container, and you wanna ship that model. Finally, right, you get it done, success. You've got it out there, things are working great, you're monitoring it, awesome. And then this guy shows up. So cyber comes along and says, hey, you know, we've noticed a few things about that model you deployed recently, and we'd just like you to take it down, please, because we've noticed some critical vulnerabilities in it. And you're like, wait, what? What vulnerability? What is this? I've never heard of these vulnerabilities. What are these things? And so, right, you're forced to take this model down, and now you've removed it from production, right? It's been blocked because there's problems with it. So hopefully today, by the end of tonight, you'll have a better idea of why this might happen. Has anyone here dealt with container vulnerabilities in their day-to-day job? Yeah, okay. If you work for specific companies, maybe the financial sector, maybe the government sector, maybe in a lot of different things, this is gonna be a concern. So today, where are we headed? Is that still too loud? I feel like it's good, cool. Sounds really loud to me. All right, so where we're headed. So we're gonna talk really, really quickly about containerized applications, right? Where it came from, why we're doing it a lot today. We're gonna talk a little bit about different words that are used when we talk about containers. Why do we also do containerization when we talk about machine learning? Talk about the dreaded CVE, talk about what that word means here. And tools and practices for maintaining these machine learning images. This applies really to anything, any kind of application development, this applies. So let's talk a little bit about where containerized applications came from. So back in 2006, it seems so long ago, right? Not that long ago. So a thing called process containers was launched by Google, right? And they did that to limit or kind of contain the amount of resources that an application would use. Instead of using a traditional VM approach, right, rather than spinning up a machine, they would use, right, these process containers. A couple years later now, Linux containers was born, right? And this was like the first complete implementation of a container manager on any system. Mind you, it still wasn't easy to do this yet, right? Not until PyCon 2013 in Santa Cruz did this thing called Docker come out. And then, oh, what is this? And it's funny is at PyCon. But Docker debuts their open source project of containerization, how you can build containerized applications. So not too long after that now, we're like, oh, this is great, containerization, this is awesome. Then the importance of container security kind of starts coming to the surface, right? So now we're talking 7 years ago. And then we start seeing the maturity of certain container tools. Containerd, and that RKK becomes part of the CNCF, and Kate's Kubernetes grows up, right? So now that's a thing now. Google's open source that. And now containerizing your applications becomes the gold standard. Great, awesome. So what does this really mean? So this was cool. So 3 years ago, Eric's not here tonight, I was gonna harass him a bit. 3 years ago, Eric gave a really good talk in this speed up about Docker for data scientists. And to this day is one of the best kind of concise explanations of Docker in data science. It's been 3 years since then. And looking back now, it's like, okay, where are we at? This was, if you look again back at the timeline, this was still pretty new, right? In terms of when application development through containerization was coming out to today. So Docker images and containers. What are they? So let's talk about a little bit of the verbiage used. I feel like I'm echoing like crazy. Okay, great, okay. All right, so like an image is the binary, right? Let's talk about some more. Okay, backtrack here. The lexicon. So an image, when we talk about an image, right, we're talking about the binary specifically that's used as a blueprint for the specific runtime you're trying to deploy. It doesn't become a container until you've taken that image and actually put it into an environment. That is when it's a container. Sometimes you hear people mix those things up. And then talk about an orchestrator. So image container, great, but orchestrator now is the tool that allows you to do coordination, scheduling, and communication between deployed containers in some kind of environment. Kubernetes, ECS, examples, Docker Swarm, these are all examples of container orchestrators. Okay, now let's talk about it in the terms of machine learning. So you come across containerization, it's very prolific. It's from start to finish in terms of the machine learning development lifecycle, it's very much a part of all the steps, right? So starting with EDA, right? You got exploratory data analysis, you got your Jupyter notebooks there, for example. So here I've got like a little screenshot of, this is Kubeflow in this case, but the point is, you're using a container in this case, whether you're using Google Cloud, whether you're using AWS SageMaker, doesn't matter. You're using some kind of container to create an environment for you to work within. And in most cases, that environment for your EDA step, you don't care what it is. You just need it to work. You don't care how big it is. You don't really care about optimizing it. You just want it to work. Okay, now we start going into a model training part of things. All right, so now at this point, you may not care as much as well how big this container is. So for example, maybe you've got a container off of the NVIDIA container registry for a PyTorch GPU model because you're doing some training that way. So there it is, part of the model training part. I think we'll do the handheld. This is better. This, and I can control the volume. This is good. All right. Okay, batch serving. Okay, so then another way you see it is in batch serving. So again, we talk about batch serving, you're talking about running some kind of inference model onto your model on the schedule, right? So we've got examples of that. It's easy to say, okay, I've got a scheduled job. I want to process this transaction data, whatever it is, on some cadence. I deploy a model into a container, and that runs on some cadence. Same thing applies for real-time serving or real-time inference, right? So you've got some endpoint, you've taken a model, you've deployed that endpoint to, say, on the cloud, and again, you've got a container that is acting when data comes in, that model runs on that data, spits back the response. So in every step of essentially the machine learning development lifecycle, and I'm not even including all of the infrastructure that usually goes around to house that as well, you're using containers. So I mean, if we just look popular machine learning containers, if I go to Docker Hub today, I can go and get Python image and get a PyTorch image, right? Get all kinds of ones, TensorFlow, get a SciPy notebook image from Jupyter, right? This is a nice public repository of all of these binaries for me to go and grab an environment that I want and run it. It's great until this. All right, so CVE. This is where we're at in our journey. So who's heard this term before today? Yeah, sure, you guys have, right? Common vulnerabilities and exposures, right? So it's a list of publicly disclosed computer security flaws, right? You know, this list is maintained publicly and it's out there for everyone to see whenever a vulnerability is found with an operating system, with a piece of software, and anything else in between that. All right, so that is what CVE is. So this is great. The problem is now when we think about containers, this is definitely how I once upon a time used to think about containers. I just think about my home rig. I've got some NVIDIA containers that I just store on my Linux box there, and I use them when I want to mess around with something, right? Maybe want to mess around with a model or not. Those images are there in a local repository on my disk. They always work because they're the same environment every time. Do I ever touch those after I've downloaded them from like the public repository? I've made my modifications. I don't touch them. There's a problem with that. It's pretty much just like I've bought a computer or put a computer or a server and they never update it. Probably fine for a while, but after a long time, it's going to be riddled with a lot of security holes because all the time, hackers, whatever, are trying to get in and exploit software. So You actually have to scan these things. So just like you receive an update on your personal computer for, hey, update Mac OS, update Windows, update whatever, update the software. You need to do the same for your containers, but things are a little more tricky in that sense. Because now you're trying to, it's not really that much tricky in the sense, but you've got to deploy it and scan the thing. And there's tools to do that. We'll talk about several of them today. So Trivy, it's an open source tool owned by Aquasec that allows you to run container scans locally or wherever, part of a CI chain, whatever. AWS ECR. So this is probably fairly recent. I don't know exactly when AWS added this in there. I know it wasn't always the case, but if you push an image to AWS ECR, Elastic Container Registry, you can use that tool to also scan for vulnerabilities in your image. All did you speak? I think Container Registry is actually went out the door. If I'm not mistaken, I got an email from Google the other day, so I think it's just GCP Artifact Registry now for everything. So they've got ability to scan there. And then Docker Scout, that's a newer offering from Docker. It's coming, it's out there. And then another open source one called Gripe. All right, so these are tools. And we're going to specifically look at some of these today. So let's start. All right, so this is fun. So let's scan some stuff. I've got Trivy on this laptop here. And we're going to go ahead and grab the Python 3.9.16 image from Docker Hub. Public image available. We're going to pull it down. And we're going to scan this thing. And specifically, we're going to be looking for critical, high, and medium, however Trivy determines that, critical, high, and medium vulnerabilities. We'll put the output to a JSON file. Then I have a fun little Python script that just parses that, summarizes the information for us. Now, because I know live demos are scary, I just did a GIF. I did this last night, so yes. Oh yeah, and I made a just file to do all these things. I'll show you the repository later. Okay, so first thing, we pull the image down. Trivy does its work here, and then spit out the result. We'll let it play one more time. And the reason why I didn't do this as a live demo is because this database that Trivy is pulling from to scan for vulnerabilities will change every day. So if it worked last night and we'll see why, and I found vulnerabilities, I could find new vulnerabilities today that would not be part of what I anticipated. So, and then we'd have a fun little time troubleshooting where those came from. But as you can see here, this is the results. Trivy found in the language packages, there's one medium severity vulnerability. There's 19 critical operating system vulnerabilities, 235 high vulnerabilities, and 254 medium. That's from a publicly available image. So that seems like a lot. And so then what do? What do we do with this? How do we fix this? Well, here's the thing. Of all those vulnerabilities, at least from Aquasec's perspective and from the CVE list, only a handful of those are actually fixable, meaning I can actually do something about those, right, today. So we're going to redo our scan. We're going to now add a new flag in there called ignore unfixed. It's just Trivy's part of their CLI, and we'll see what happens then. So again, I run my little just file here. It's got the commands built in. Pull down the Docker image. Trivy goes through and scans it. Comes out quite a bit better. Okay. So, well, before it was a lot. Now, not so much. We still have a medium language package. I mean, that's a problem with some of the software installed here on the image, likely Python. OS package is high, only 9 now, better than the 230, whatever it was before. And medium 2. So things are looking better already. But how do we fix them? So in theory, if these are fixable, meaning that there has been a fix published and it's been added to the CVEs, the container, right, the publicly available vulnerability lists that are there, I should just actually be able to do an operating system upgrade and hopefully remediate those vulnerabilities. So first we need to start with the operating system. We'll start with the operating system vulns. So in this case, we'll just create a really simple Docker file. We're going to pull down their Python image. We're going to just run an update and install those updates on that image and see what happens. So new just file, it does go and run the Docker build, which was already cached, so it went really fast. On my laptop, came through. What do we see? All of the operating system vulnerabilities that are fixable are gone. So that's nice. So now, what do we do about the Python ones? Well, so part of the Trivy tool, you can go in and look exactly at what the information is telling about your vulnerabilities. So in this case, if we go digging through the JSON file that it shoves out there, there's a part of that that talks about the vulnerabilities, tells you the associated CVE, so CVE 2022-40897, specifically the issues with setup tools. Python, it's a Python issue. So it tells you where it's at in the image, and then it tells you you've currently got 58.1 installed, 65.5.1 is going to fix your problem, according to this CVE. So we try it out. So we'll make a quick modification to our Docker file. We'll pull from Python, we'll update this operating system, and we'll go ahead and just, for this case, we'll go ahead and fix the version of setup tools so that we actually see what happens there. And I wish I could tell you this is going to be really exciting. It's not, because it's all gone now. What's exactly, right? So this is so wonderful. Woohoo! We've got rid of all of these things. That's great, right? Maybe. So there's problems with all these things, though. So let's go through that now. So it's great. We were able to solve with Trivy. We were able to find at least all of the vulnerabilities that were fixable by Trivy with simply updating the image we got from Docker Hub there. So we were able to do that update, and then we can use that image now for at least a day before new vulnerabilities are found. So looking at this same image, I pushed this up to AWS ECR, did a scan on it. And so if you look at here, here's the image pushed up. There's a scan button to the far left there. What happened? So I do that. And these results don't look the same as what Trivy was pointing out, right? We've got a critical here, 14 high here, 39 medium, and blah, blah, blah. You can see these informational, undefined low. We're not going to worry about those. But there's the issue, right? We're just seeing different numbers. And if I go now to Docker Hub, and this is new as of, I think, gosh, I don't know when this came out, but you go into UI, you can see the vulnerabilities. They're starting to scan now using Docker Scout, I believe. They're starting to scan their images that are pushed to their hub. You can see here, if you start looking at all of the issues or the vulnerabilities there, you'll notice there are no highs or criticals, only mediums and some lows. And you're like, wait a minute here. So what is the difference? Why is there so much difference in these results? So this kind of is getting to the heart of some of the issues with this approach here. So all scanners aren't created equally. This specific slide right here was actually taken from a really good talk at KubeCon this year in Germany. So these 4 individuals gave a talk about malicious compliance. It was pretty awesome. They actually went through and proved that they could trick these scanners without actually changing anything about the image and remove all the vulnerabilities. But the point is that I'm trying to make here is that you can see there's just a difference with all of these different scanning tools. Trivy's got this many, Gripe's got a lot more. It's finding a ton more binary issues. Docker Scan seems to find a lot more operating system issues, a lot less binary. Docker Scout's a different story. So you get this kind of this distribution of what is in fact a vulnerability, and it really depends on the flavor of scanner you are using. So great, Ryan, that's really not helpful, right? So what I've learned so far is there's vulnerabilities sometimes in my images. I can fix them, supposedly, at least some of them. And if depending on what scanner I use, I get different results. The answer is yeah, that's where the state of things are. So where do you go from here? Like, how do we actually implement? How do we actually use these results? How do I make this as part of a best practice for my company or my organization? So the biggest thing here is standardizing what scans and severity your company uses. So first and foremost, right, we saw that all the scanners aren't the same. So whatever you do as an organization, you just need to do the same thing. So team A, if you're worried about vulnerabilities, you don't want one team scanning using Trivy and another team over here using Docker Scout, right? That's an obvious thing because at that point you're going to have different looks in terms of you're going to have different results, and so remediation is going to look a lot different for both of those teams. So standardizing on the scanners themselves, that's extremely important. Also, what is your risk tolerance, right? Depending on what you're building, maybe it doesn't even matter if you have what's defined as a medium vulnerability, based again on the scanner you're using. Also, when do your scans actually happen? And when I mean that, I'm meaning like, does it happen as part of a nightly testing process? Does it happen as part of before you push something to an artifact registry? Is it so? At what point in your development life cycle you actually start looking and caring about these things? Is it before you build a model? Is it after you've built the model? Is it before you deployed it? Right. So where in your machine learning development life cycle, when does it happen? Okay. So again, one thing I would definitely, would advocate for is scanning. Make this automatic. Put this as part of your CI pipeline. So for example, this is an example of a Trivy GitHub action. So Trivy has a GitHub action that you can essentially take and use as a template to add to your CI pipeline and GitHub actions, right? So as you're moving your software through, as you're deploying something, you can include it in here, right? And there's a myriad of other ways you can do this. And then the question is what do we do with that information? So if we scan an image, do we still let it go to the registry? Do we let it get deployed? Do we stop it? Do we break, do we stop the deployment and then start over? So those are some other things, but again, automate it. So it's not something you have to think about later on. And then just going over some network security principles, right? So this kind of goes to who has access, who can get to my image at the end of the day. If this is an image that's hosting a model and it's on the back end of your cluster and there's only one other, let's say, container that can access this, maybe it's not much of a concern, right? So again, you want to look at things like security groups, right? How are you controlling traffic to those instances? And a lot of this is from an AWS perspective, but it doesn't really matter. It applies to pretty much anywhere you're deploying these types of things. What about your network access control list, right? Where's the inbound and outbound traffic control, the subnet level happening? You can manage access through IAM, right? So IAM roles or any kind of like role-based security, you can do that. You definitely be logging and monitoring all the types of traffic. So again, you're knowing who and where is coming from. So again, you know who has access to these containers and what types of issues they can, what can they get to. And then, network analyzer tools are great too as well to again see who or what resources have access in your VPC. And then of course, just a firewall type situation, right? What are the rules that allow network traffic to go in and out? So again, this is all about just building a fence as best you can around wherever you're deploying your images, your machine learning models in this case, right? And then a really big one that I don't think people realize is don't give your containers root access. So every time you build a container from a Docker file or you pull it down, in a lot of cases, those containers have root access, right? Or they can be set up that way, just have root. Change that. As part of your build, change your root user, install what you need inside of that image, and then create another user, the app user, we'll call it, right? Create that person, whoever that is, or just the default user, give them the root user should have given them the right privileges of what they can access and set that as the user that the container uses. So do not run as root essentially in your containers. It's really easy to do that type of thing. And then again, of course, the hardest thing is the remediation process itself. So you can do a lot of these other things, but ideally there should be some practice, some process into actually fixing the garbage that comes out of these things at times. So it's by far it's the toughest, but it's the most important to do. And because like we saw, some vulnerabilities are remediated simply by an operating system update, nothing more. You can just update the operating system in there, and you're usually not going to affect how their software runs. usually. There's a problem, but you can definitely see where there's issues where that could be an issue, especially if you're dealing with highly complex containers that maybe deal with like GPU devices. That could be a problem. But other types of vulnerabilities require like upgrading packages. For a long time, if you're a Java developer, this log4j vulnerability to this day still is causing a lot of issues. And it was an extremely critical vulnerability that has plagued a lot of companies in general. Right. So in this case, you actually have to mitigate this thing at a package level. And in a lot of cases, it was just you could upgrade and get over it. But depending on, let's say you're running Spark or you're running some other Java-based tool, that is harder said. That's easier said than done to just upgrade your logging package. Because when you're thinking about machine learning, again, the beauty of containers is it runs the same every time because nothing has changed. But if I change something, I can't guarantee it's going to run the same way again. So again, it can break your environment. Kind of the joke back to malicious compliance. Again, you can trick scanners and you can change absolutely nothing about your image and still come out clean with your scans, but that's obviously not great for your company or your career, I'd say. Sure is fun to do it. So, kind of in summary. So you want to scan, the big thing is you want to standardize what scans your organization requires and the risk tolerance around those. You want to set up your continuous integration pipelines to scan image builds for vulns. This is the big one. I think this is extremely important. If you're doing anything when deploying images, you should have this as part of your CI process. Just practice network security, right? Probably one of the harder ones. I never considered myself a network person. It's always boggling to me. But again, it's important to understand at least what you can do to kind of build that fence around whatever you deploy. Again, just ask the question, who can get to my container when it's out there? Don't run as root. And then again, like, what is your remediation process? What does that look like? How much time do you allow people to actually solve problems, et cetera, et cetera? So that's it. This is what I kind of want to talk about today, is more or less an awareness thing, because even though it applies in application development, it definitely applies as well in the machine learning world. If you're putting anything into a container, this is something, and you're putting it out there for people to use, this is something you need to be considering. So that's it. Any questions? If not, yes. Okay, so the question is, so there's a bunch of machine learning containers that exist that have unfixable vulns in them, right? Yes. The answer is yes, that's true. The reality is, if we think about what is open source, is great, right? Open source provides a lot of tooling, but it also comes with that like two-edged sword. Because if I'm an open source developer and I'm putting stuff out there for the public to use, do I really care about the security practice around that? Probably not. That's not the fun part of the job. The fun part is building the tool that people are going to use that help you get your job done. It's not the scanning process. It's not the vulnerability maintaining it. Because the sad thing is like, once I push that image to the Docker repository, I have to continually update that now if I want to keep remediating vulns. But in the unfixable case, yeah, I mean, your computer today has a bunch of vulnerabilities on it that are also unfixable. So that's just the world we live in. However, if you really were into that, or only that, you would be very involved in trying to fix those issues. But as you can see in that first scan, right, it's a lot. I won't even go back to it. It's hundreds just in that Python image, right? So, any other questions? That answer? Yeah, good. Okay, yeah.
I was just gonna. I got another microphone. There's a bunch over here. So.
What's that? Oh, mics, please.
We can do that to make it easier if you want. But our security team, like, we've been doing a bunch of like migration from our legacy platform to Kubernetes, and none of that's like strictly machine learning specific, but container security is really hard. That goes without saying. But someone made the analogy or shared the analogy to me. They said, like, containers are great, but the way we treat containers today is the equivalent of like when you would search like movie download, and it's like movie.exe, and you just like open that up trustingly. I mean, that's the way we treat containers, and we need to not think of it that way. Like, we need to see the dark side of it, but also then leverage the power of containers, just be more, I don't know, smart more intelligent about it. I know like some companies will have for ML and for like runtimes, or like their Go container or the Ruby or Python containers, they will have like a blessed runtime container, and you have to always use that base, and they guarantee to keep it updated and vulnerability free. But even then, it still requires a lot of work.
Yeah. I mean, Gary hit the nail on the head there. That is absolutely true. Like there is, as a company, as an organization, it's really important to kind of standardize that process of what's our blessed container, right? What's our base image that we build things off of, so that it, at least from that perspective, is maintained or kept clean. So Dan, you had a question about that? Yeah.
Wait.
Oh wait, Mike.
Wait for the mic.
Yeah, awesome. First a comment. So closed source stuff has vulnerabilities too. You just don't know about it as much. So that's
Point, yeah.
that's also there. Other question. So your CI and testing, wanted you maybe to talk about that. Like, if you're doing updates, and especially if that's automated, how do you test and stuff to catch like issues with your software?
Yeah, that's a really good question. A really hard question to kind of think around. But the question is about right. How if I'm testing, if I've got testing for vulnerabilities as part of my CI process, how then, if something is a problem or not, how do I know that I've, once I fix the vulnerabilities, how do I know my software still works the way I expect it to? Because that's you gotta close that loop actually. So that's hard. How, depending on how you're doing that, it depends on what environment you're running on. But you got to have that last step to close the loop. So you scan an image, you find a bunch of vulnerabilities, you then go out and maybe you have an automated process to remediate those. Great, it runs an update. Maybe there's something smart process there, or you manually update it, you rerun it through. Great, it passes the vulnerability check. What is the other thing you have to do, right? So unit tests should be part of that process, right? So make sure your code in there still works. But then also, what about the integration side of things? Do you know, like if it's a model in there, there should be a set series of tests that would be an integration test that tests, does this model still do exactly what I expect it to? At least in some of the use cases that I've tested before. So I don't know if that's where you're going at, Dan, but that's exactly, you got to close the loop there. So once you fix the vulnerabilities, does the software still run the way I expect it? And sometimes it doesn't. And that's when decisions have to be made at an organization level. Is how important is this software I'm trying to deploy, this model I'm trying to deploy, versus how much risk tolerance can we accept, right? And so there's a trade-off there. But good one. Question. Yeah.
Is one of the risks someone getting in there and poisoning the data that you use to train your models, or is that outside the purview of what you're talking about?
That's a good question. So, I mean, that potentially is. Now, usually you're not storing any sort of data inside the container itself, right? The container is just a runtime that has your model in it, right? You're feeding data into it, and then you're collecting that output. The issue is if, for example, if someone was able to get into your environment, they can get into that container. And if, like, for example, if it's running as root, I now have a lot of control on whatever I'm deployed on, whatever platform I'm on, right? I can now start accessing potentially other things that I'm not supposed to get to. If your model is like public facing, or you have an endpoint that's public facing, right? Depending on, again, your network security and the vulnerabilities that are inside that container, you potentially have created a doorway into your environment, right? From the outside in. So the big issue is not so much the data, it's more or less you're giving, in order for stuff to work on a network, you have to literally poke holes in the network. So the question is with those holes, how big are they? How do I protect against them? And what do they allow people to do if they do get through? And that's the big thing, is if someone gets through, what can they do? That's the risk. Good question.
Anything else?
Dan's got another one.
I'll go again. So one thing that comes to mind is containers often work with other containers.
Yeah.
You got sidecars and you've got loggers and stuff like that. Do you ever run into the problem where you update one and it doesn't work with, like, the containers don't work together?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So you see this a lot on a Kubernetes platform, where if you think about a Kubernetes, how you're right, you put pods hold containers, right? They're small, so the containers go inside these pods. And like Dan pointed out, you might have a pod that has your main application in it, but it has this little sidecar container, it's called, that's literally just logging things from the main one, right? It's putting it out somewhere. So let's say you have that main application container, and maybe that sidecar container, you actually don't have direct control of it because it's part of maybe whatever open source software you might be deployed or using. So what happens when you make an update and all of a sudden now this container that it's supposed to communicate with, or maybe it's just another database container, whatever, breaks, right? You definitely see that issue. So that's part, I think, go back to the testing part from an integration perspective. So when your container gets built and when it gets deployed, not only do you need to ensure that the software inside of it runs, but then of course on the integration side, you got to put it back into a simulated environment and make sure it actually runs as well. So I think at that point, that's where it's really important to have your sort of QA, your dev QA type environments where things are replicated before they actually end up to a production environment to test that. So that's what I'd say. That's one of the ways I've seen it. It's not, again, it's a lot of hoops to jump through, right? It's not easy to do it. But yeah, it's a good one. Matt, yeah. Like Chris got.
Hey, man. I want to hear more about solid model integration testing. I haven't seen a whole lot of really great strategies. Do you have any recommendations?
Man, that's a good question. I'm going to say, like, I won't consider myself an expert at that. That's hard. I'm gonna flounder here a bit because I think there's a million things come to mind, right? The model type, right? You're building, the data type you're doing. Where is this model deployed? What type of environment? Exactly. You're trying to avoid that, right? You're not going to put your training set in the pod. That's crazy, right? I would say that, again, it comes back to this. The best you can do is the standardization part of, okay, so you've trained this model on some data, right? And you supposedly did some validation on that model, right, before you put it out there. So standardizing that validation data potentially is something that could also be part of your testing, right? So I've got this, my validation data now lives as part of my integration test before deployment. And so when I go through, scan my container, before I deploy my model, as part of that integration test, I actually use that data and go back to and validate it against what I saw before. And again, it's not perfect, right? Because there's going to be variations, but you're going to have at least more confidence that the model's still behaving in a way that when you trained it, at least, right? And again, how you do all of that process depends on where you're running, right? Especially in the cloud, I think it makes it a little bit easier because of where you can store that data. But I definitely think that when you're developing your model, if you have the end state in mind, like, okay, I'm going to actually take this to production. Well, what does that mean? That means more than just the environment I deploy it to. It means all of this lineage, all this data lineage and everything, model lineage, everything that deals with it. That's part of this whole artifact that gets sent out. And that is also what becomes sort of my, what's the word I want to use? Just kind of like it's the standard of which you're going to measure it against before as updates are made, especially if your model's not changing, it's just a software change, then that's a little bit easier. The model changes, well, in that case, that's a new artifact, right? And that just needs to be carried forward. Easier said than done, but in my mind, that's the ideal model. I don't have a shortcut. I wish. Yeah, that's probably a really good idea for a piece of software, actually. So, Matt, yeah.
Yeah, so you brought up a ton of different scanners. Do you have a preference, or what's your favorite? Which one's the fastest?
I like your question. Honestly, I don't have a preference. I think Trivi's nice because I do think Aquasec has got a pretty good reputation in terms of like a security company. So Trivi is if I'm doing something personally, I would actually use Trivi. But I'm not going to say, again, they're different, right? And I didn't emphasize that well enough. When you're going about standardizing what it is or what scanner you're going to use in your organization, it is important at that point when you're evaluating, you understand how those scanners work. It was beyond the scope of this talk, talking about how each one of these scanners do their job, but they do it a little bit differently. They might be looking for just specific files. That's how you can trick these things. Once you learn how they work, you can then start removing the things they're looking for in your container, and all of a sudden everything's clean. Because sometimes they're just literally looking for some like software bill of materials inside there. They're looking for some version file. They're just in some directory. And if it's not there, like, oh, hey, fine, good. Right? No, it's not the case. So you need to understand how these things work and standardize that and understand exactly what you're getting when you pick one. Because usually once you pick something, you're going to stick with it for at least a bit before you kind of implement something else. That's good. Yeah, no favor. I think the trivia worked well. What I didn't explain that I was doing there, the hard thing about trivia, this is kind of an issue with it, is with a Docker local runtime environment, you actually cannot scan a local image in a local registry. So I actually had to, I didn't show it there, but in the just file, I had to actually pull down their image, update the database, tell it, and then scan my Python container inside like a Docker run environment. So I had to actually have two containers running and scan them. So it's kind of it's weird, but yeah, that's just a limitation that it has, right? But and that's how you would do it in a CI pipeline. You do that way rather than have it running on locally on your laptop, whatever. But yeah.
No questions? Okay, let's give him a big ol' round of applause.
Thank you, everybody.